Go ahead and get started. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. We're excited to be back with you here today for the third and final installment of our training webinar series for derivative suppliers. My name is Michael Nowlett from Earthworm Foundation. I will be helping to moderate this webinar today. Before we get started, a few important announcements and ground rules. All participants will be muted for the webinar today. At the end of the webinar, we will have about 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A session. Please type your questions in the chat feature and we will do our best to answer your questions live. If there are too many questions to answer live, we'll answer all of the questions in writing after the webinar and distribute those responses in a document. Throughout the webinar, there will be a few live interactive polling questions. We encourage you to please participate in these polling questions. It will help us to better understand the audience and your experience level, and your response will be anonymous live during the webinar. The webinar will be recorded. In a few days, we will send a follow-up email with the webinar recording and the presentation materials. We'll also be sending a quick follow-up survey. So please take a moment to complete that survey. It'll take you just about 2 or 3 minutes to do that. We really appreciate the feedback, and it will help us continue to develop better content for future webinars. Just very quickly, before we get started, I just wanted to note this antitrust statement. So the organizers of this webinar shall not enter into any discussion, activity, or conduct that may infringe on its part or on the part of its participants any applicable competition law. I won't read the whole thing here, but I just want everyone to keep this in mind, especially as there's interaction in the chat. And we also know that there are many different companies on this call. So please keep that in mind today. Today, you will be hearing from a few different speakers. The grievance and non-compliance management training will be led by Rob and John from Earthworm Foundation. We're also very pleased to have a guest speaker on today's webinar. Tina from Oleon will be highlighting Oleon's grievance management approach and some of the specific challenges related to their supply chain. We also have Deborah and Rhiannon, who will introduce the Consumer Goods Forum, the Forest Positive Coalition, and the Palm Oil Roadmap. They'll also frame palm oil derivatives in the context of CGF FPC. Lastly, we also have Ron Jacoby from Colgate-Palmolive. Here we have the table of contents for the webinar today. So as you can see, we have a lot of content to cover. We're going to try and move through it quickly, but we'll be taking you through, what is a grievance and why is it important, talking about the anatomy of a grievance, the grievance process, decision trees, and then we'll also kind of move into how you go about building this process and procedure within your company. And then we'll also talk about kind of operationalizing everything you have learned on the webinar today. At the very end of the training, we'll also have Oleon come in. This is where Tina will come in, and she'll kind of highlight Oleon's approach to grievances. And as I noted, some of the challenges that they've also faced specifically related to grievances and their non-compliance management approach. We also have some examples of public grievance mechanisms and procedures, and some really good tools and resources that can help you after this webinar to dive a little bit deeper into some of the concepts and topics that we discussed today. So before we embark on our training journey, this one being the last of the 3, let's take a moment to understand the purpose of the event today and the whole webinar series. So the development of forest positive derivative supply chains has been a little bit slower in comparison to traditional PO and PKO supply chains. This can be explained by various factors such as complex technical considerations, limited consumer awareness, and a lack of regulatory focus. This webinar series was crafted to inspire and empower derivative suppliers to drive positive change within their company. The primary objective is to deepen suppliers' grasp of NDPE and forest positive issues and foster a commitment to catalyzing action. This webinar series is being sponsored by Colgate-Palmolive and the Consumer Goods Forum, and the technical training is being delivered by Earthworm Foundation. So just kind of, before we dive into this grievance topic, I think it's really important to understand kind of how this fits into a general implementation approach, and also understanding kind of, why grievances are important to businesses, right? So one thing that's very important to note is that, the UN does have guiding principles on businesses and human rights, and there's some very specific guidance within that principle on how companies should be managing grievances. This one is a little bit specific to human rights, but kind of a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today are also referenced in that document from the UN that is specifically talking about how to manage grievances and how to be transparent about that process, right? So really managing grievances is not just about being ethical, it's essential for your business strategy. So the palm oil industry has high expectations that change quickly, and how you deal with grievances can either boost your reputation, strengthen your relationship with key players, or put your business at risk in the long run. So we're going to talk about some of those things today. And another reason why we're doing this webinar is that we've assessed quite a few derivative suppliers over the last few years, and we have some good data that shows that there are a handful of suppliers that are actively managing grievances and are being transparent about progress. But on the other hand, we do have quite a few suppliers that do not have non-compliant supplier progress, are not actively managing grievances, do not have a grievance log, or have an internal suspend or drop list. So if you look at some of this data from the 16 suppliers that we assessed last year, 56% of those suppliers have a grievance or non-compliant supplier process. So, while I think we are seeing some good progress over the last few years, and this number continues to increase, there still are some suppliers in these NDPE supply chains that are lagging behind. So with that being said, I'm going to pass it over to Deborah from CGF, and she's going to give a little introduction on CGF and the Forest Positive Coalition. Deborah?
Thanks, Michael. So to quickly introduce myself, I'm Deborah Diaz. I'm a senior manager on the environmental sustainability team at the Consumer Goods Forum, and I lead the Forest Positive Coalition. For those of you unaware of what the Consumer Goods Forum is, it's a CEO-led organization bringing together about 400 companies and organizations in the consumer goods industry, and our focus is on pre-competitive collaboration. We drive positive change by addressing key challenges impacting the industry, and that includes environmental and social issues. The CGF Forest Positive Coalition is currently comprised of 22 leading consumer goods companies, retailers, manufacturers, and food service companies committed to addressing deforestation, conversion, and moving together towards a forest positive future. We believe that our collective reach will enable the companies in the coalition and beyond to make progress on 4 goals. So the first 2 are really key for the audience of this webinar, which is around accelerating efforts to reach individual deforestation conversion-free supply chains, setting higher expectations for suppliers and traders to act across their entire supply base and become themselves deforestation and conversion free. And we also work with the members to drive transformational change in key commodity landscapes, bringing on other actors along with us as well, and defining measurable outcomes to track and report and make sure that we are transparent and hold ourselves accountable throughout all of our work. And with that, I will hand to Rhiannon to go into a bit more detail.
Great, thanks, Deborah. So zooming in a little bit more on palm oil specifically, the Forest Positive Coalition developed the palm oil roadmap and published that publicly in 2020. This outlines these 5 elements that you can see here. And within these 5 elements, companies have commitments that they make. They also have these actions that are individual and collective, as well as some KPIs that are reported on publicly annually. Most relevant for the webinar today is mostly element 2, which relates to suppliers and traders, and having these commitments, the same level of forest positive commitments across their own business, and also element 3, which also includes grievance management. Moving on to the next slide. Within the palm oil working group within the FPC, this year, palm derivatives was identified as a key priority area for action. Members have identified that this is an area of existing challenges and can be addressed collaboratively. So you can see here that there's some opportunities to build critical mass through working with existing sectoral initiatives such as Earthworm and ASD. This webinar would come under that category, but also trying to address shared challenges to ensure that companies can report on their palm derivatives, but also that they can get this information from their suppliers as well. So passing back to Michael.
Okay, thanks, Rhiannon. Before we launch into the grievance training, I thought it would be a good idea to just do a quick recap of webinar 1 and webinar 2. So webinar 1 was on policy and webinar 2 was on traceability. So for the policy webinar, there's many different things that we learned. But when it comes down to kind of creating that policy, we talked about gathering internal policy documents and assembling the right team. You know, writing a policy that aligns with your company values, addresses your company risks, and meets industry standards. Identify how the policy will be implemented, both in the short term and in the long term. Have external parties review your policy, and then report on progress and adapt as needed. We obviously know that things are continuously changing. There's new standards that are coming out. There's no expectations. So we need to go back and look at that policy every few years and to make sure that it's refreshed and up to date. Policy is really the foundation for, you know, everything that we're talking about, including traceability, including grievances, and of course traceability, and having that traceability data is also fundamental to grievances, and we'll talk more about that today. But in terms of traceability, you know, defining those data agreements with suppliers, not just the format of how the data will be received, but also the timeline. Is it going to be quarterly? Is it going to be biannually? Is it going to be annually? Streamline that data management by creating a clear process for receiving, reviewing, and storing supplier data. Establishing those traceability nodes, which we talked about a little bit, having either regional manufacturing facilities or combined for your whole company. Determining the percent of PO and PKO volumes for each supplier and calculating those scores, and then sharing out the data. So we do have the link to both of the recordings here, so we encourage you to go back and take a look at those. If anyone does need the presentation materials and did not receive them, please contact me directly and I'll be happy to share that with you. Okay, so before we get started, we're going to launch a polling question. It looks like we may have an issue with the polling questions, so I'm not sure we'll be able to do that today. So I think we're just going to continue on and move forward. Apologies. Oh, there we go. Okay. I wasn't able to find where that was, so thank you very much. So here's polling question 1. So what experience have you had in managing grievances? Just take 1 or 2, maybe 1 minute to think about your answer to this. You can select multiple answers here. So the responses are, we have a fully operational grievance process tied to our NDP policy. We are planning to establish a grievance mechanism. We receive requests from customers to act on grievances. We receive requests from investors to act on grievances. We have never considered creating a grievance mechanism due to a lack of demand. And then lastly, we have an internal grievance process, but haven't considered one linked to our supply chain. About 10 more seconds, and then we can close the poll. Okay. So it looks like we have a mix of folks who have a operational grievance process that's tied to an NDPE policy, which is great. So I hope for those folks on the call today, maybe you can learn about how you can strengthen your program and continue to grow that program. And then I see we have a mix here that are planning to establish a grievance mechanism and have also received requests from customers to act on grievances. So I hope the webinar will be most beneficial to those companies that have responded this way. And we look forward to diving into the content. So with that being said, I am going to pass it over to Rob, who is going to be leading our grievance and non-compliance management training. Over to you, Rob.
Hey, thanks very much, Michael, and hello to everybody. Excuse me. Yeah, my name is Rob Collier, and I'm leading a team within Earthworm that supports a number of companies in how they respond to public grievances. And we've got many years now of this, particularly in the palm oil sector, but also looking at other commodities now as well. So just to comment on those polling results, I was expecting that a lot of the demand you got was from customers, because that's kind of from where you sit in the supply chain. It's also good to see that 62% of you either have got a operational system or are working towards it. We added the question about investors, because that's kind of a new thing we're seeing, that there is now financial institutions are starting to look at this now, and we see a number of times we get requests through our members. So, but without further ado, should we get cracking? And you want to move on the next slide, Michael? Thanks. So this is what we'll cover, and hopefully what you will take from the session. So we'll talk about just what our grievances, just to give absolute clarity what we're talking about, and and a little bit why they're important, what is their impact. We'll talk about the process and the decision trees that underpin it. Hopefully, understand the principle of decision trees, and we have some that kind of underpin the way grievances are handled. We will talk about the mechanics of it within your own organisation, how it's important to plug in the right parts of your organisation. And then again, the practicalities of how would you get to that point and make it work. And that's the key thing, is training needs to have something that you can take away that you can use. We'll also go through some real life examples, and this image on the right is a recent case. We won't go through this one, as it's very recent. But we'll talk through some examples, and hopefully that'll bring it to life. Next slide, please, Mike. So quite simply, what is a grievance? I think it's worth just being clear that we talk about grievances in the context of workers' voice tools, things within your own organisation that allows your workers to raise problems, or whistleblower tools, sometimes called. We're not primarily talking about that here, but there is an overlap in how this works. So we are talking about these sort of reports. All these reports on the left of the screen are all slightly old now, Greenpeace reports, but for a long time, Greenpeace in palm oil really made the weather in grievances. They released these very large reports that dug into the supply chain. They went all the way through to where the problem was and could work their way back as the traceability was strong enough for that. And that final report, the moment of truth, was very targeted at brands. And this was a trend we saw where the big campaigning organizations saw the leverage was with brands with a public profile, and obviously making very specific requests. this was predominantly a deforestation campaign, and I would say in my history of dealing with grievances in palm oil, probably 80% of them have been deforestation related, but often they will have other elements to it. And obviously there are, of course, exploitation type cases as well, of which the one on the right is the most sort of prominent of recent times. I'd be surprised if you haven't heard of this case. It was in 2020 it came out, and it led to the US Customs and Border Protection putting a ban in place against Sime Darby, all palm oil from Sime Darby. I put it here as well just to show you how different grievances can be from what's on the left and the more traditional campaigning. This was a public advocacy organisation called Liberty Shared that petitioned the US government on the 1930 Tariff Act, would you believe? So even a very old legislation, but that prohibited forced labour in products that were sold on the American market. And we've seen a number of these actually have happened, and this spawned a huge sort of process to kind of figure out what, and lots of people figure out how do we deal with Sime Darby, and do we do something in America, and do we do something elsewhere? And so there was a grievance, but very, very unusual grievance, and also extremely long lasting. So it's just worth bearing in mind that as an example, that is one that has run for probably arguably is still running, and that's over 2 years ago. Next slide, please. So why should you have a grievance mechanism? So I won't go into read out everything on these slides, so we can keep some pace with what we're doing, but very simply, obviously you'll get these slides afterwards and you can read them at your leisure. But what we're essentially saying here is the structure process, first and foremost, is so important. These are complex. I hope we'll give the message today that these are complex situations, each are very case specific, and you need a process that allows you to interact with all the relevant stakeholders and play your part. But the other consequence of doing that well is it does serve as a useful risk management tool. However you feel about campaigning organizations, they are flagging up to you risks in your supply chain, and you can start to see where the patterns are, which kind of cases, which locations they're coming from. So if you don't have a good grievance process, if you don't take notice of grievances, most companies, like I said, the brands that get targeted, like in this case Procter & Gamble, it's a reputational risk that's driving them. Campaigning organizations know that they have leverage by shaming a company in the public domain. So the reputational risk is important. And in your situation, obviously, that's less a factor, but you have to kind of take on the reputational risk issue for your customers, who are typically brands. But there's also legal issues. In the Sime Darby case, if you were trading into the US, there was a risk that you were actually operating illegally. Lots of deforestation cases actually also linked to illegal clearance. So if you've got a policy that commits you to abiding by national laws from where you source, then that's important. And obviously, there's a wide range of people affected by cases. So and some of those stakeholders are stakeholders of yours as well. The last 2 points of security of supply and loss of contract is to understand that these cases come from something. They reflect something. Yes, it may be an agenda of a campaigning organisation, but it will be finding real issues with a company that's probably not well run. It's probably operating at the margins, and there will be a high risk company that, if you've got a long-term contract with, is that going to be a problem for you? And hence the point about loss of contracts. Most procurement teams are very keen to maximise the number of suppliers they can source from, and a grievance can, just put that at risk potentially. Next slide, please. So as I said, most of the cases we see in palm oil are deforestation. We're talking about tropical zones where palm oil is grown, so they're actually quite, how I say, standard. It is tropical forest loss, and rainforest loss. It's often peat, and a lot of these rainforests are on peat soils. Rainforests, as we all know, are extremely biodiverse, and they provide all sorts of ecosystem services. Most prominently would be, flood prevention. So we see a lot of cases where that's the case. Or you'll have animal-human interaction, that kind of thing, if you lose their habitats. And of course, pollution isn't a huge case in palm oil. It's usually effluent from mills spilling into rivers, and that's probably about as much as you see in palm oil. And social, very simply, does sort of splits out into, I answered a question at the start, they are either a land conflict, typically, that often does link to deforestation, where companies come in, been given or somehow secured control over land and has cleared forest. And it was maybe forest that was used by a community. And then labour rights, of which there are all these different types of potential labour issues, and of which the forced labour issue that impacted Sound Derby. Next slide, please. So I want to just quickly switch just to make a very key point about how grievances operate for companies like yours, and to really make the point that all suppliers aren't equal. And we talk about pivotal suppliers in palm oil. And I can't say for sure it's as clear in other commodities who the pivotal suppliers are, but in palm oil, we're certainly talking about a company like Wilmar, who has somewhere over 40% of the world's palm oil will touch the Wilmar supply chain somewhere. But actually the key thing is that they own refineries in the producing countries, and through that they have the key relationships. So we understand that a derivative supplier that's established in a different country has actually got quite limited scope to act on directly on cases, but companies like Wilmar have long known their responsibility. Hence, they have a clear, dynamic public log that you can see on the screen here, and they have teams who will regularly go out to the field and investigate cases, and they leverage those key commercial relationships with the mills who can be connected to cases. The second to last bullet there is just to make the point that whilst it's very important that you sort of forge those relationships with those companies, because they will be a key source of information to advance cases, they're not infallible, and you can't expect that they will just fix your problems. The important message with grievances is there's a shared responsibility, and that is definitely what the campaigning organisations will be emphasising, that there's a collective responsibility. You're all sort of beneficiaries of the supply chain. But in practical terms, when things need to happen on the ground, you really need to identify these pivotal suppliers and ideally build relationships with their sustainability teams as opposed to purely their procurement teams, which is where you've probably already got the existing relationship. Next slide, please, Michael. So this is a generic grievance process. So just to give you the helicopter view of what it looks like, and it's okay, immediately maybe looks a bit complicated, but it really isn't. And it just sort of maps out a set of standard steps we would expect in a life cycle of a grievance. And those red boxes also talk about sort of key decision points. Rather than going, and obviously the key roles as well, this is what we will dig into now. So I won't go into any more detail on this slide. So we move on, Michael. And we'll sort of break it down a little bit more. But first, we're going to go and have another go at a poll. So yeah, is there a process you can build on within your company to create your palm oil grievance mechanism? So I mentioned at the start about whistleblower tools, and obviously a number of you said in the previous poll that you do have something. So that's to build on that point, really. Do you have things you could use that you could build out to something that will cover your whole supply chain?
Just give it another maybe 10 seconds and then we'll close the poll.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've got a decent amount of responses there, and it's very good to see that there are speak-up tools already in most cases, and also supplier codes of conduct. So that is kind of normal for responsible companies, that they do have this capacity. it's not a straightforward process. We sort of move into a very different area when you look beyond your own operation. But certainly there's a lot of companies now that do look at how can they open up a grievance process beyond their own employees. Now you can literally have a website that just lets people, there's a contact point and it can come from anywhere, or you can do more sophisticated things to reach out into your supply chain. I'm not saying necessarily that's a thing that we'd necessarily see a derivatives supplier do, but it's certainly one of those things that is considered at the moment. Okay, thanks very much for those responses. Yeah, so I mentioned the decision trees earlier, and I'm not going to talk too much about these slides other than to say these are kind of generic decision trees we've created for, obviously, for deforestation, for labour, and for what we call community and land. So these are the broad areas of grievance that we see linked to NDPE, compliance. Again, these look even more complicated than the earlier diagram I showed, so we will go into more detail of it. But the idea of these is they're generic, but also should be pretty applicable to your palm oil supply chains. We would encourage you to, again, these can be shared, and we can, you can think about how do I fit, how does my organisation fit in the key decision points of this. So the next few slides will sort of look into that a little bit more using examples. So you want to move on, please, Michael? So, but before we do, I just want to, there's another decision tree linked to CGF that is worth also being aware of, called the monitoring and response framework, which breaks down to these constituent elements. So that it's produced through CGF by ProForest, and we supported this and thought it was, it's a really excellent resource. The response framework is a very detailed, multiple steps through a grievance process effectively, and with monitoring requirements. Again, it's a really good resource tool. The thing to be aware of, though, it's designed with deforestation monitoring in mind. So it is essentially a grievance process, but the trigger and the driver of it is deforestation events. So your customers may have satellite monitoring systems at their disposal. They will receive deforestation events through that. The monitoring and CGF members use the monitoring response framework to guide through how to respond to deforestation cases that may or certainly are or may be in their supply chain. So I would encourage you to look into that. There's really good online resources linked to that. Okay, thanks, Michael. Next one.
Yeah, and we also have a link to more information about MRF in the tools and resources on the last slide.
Yeah. So here we're just trying to simplify the process, and we'll come to the decision tree. So it is a life cycle, like a project life cycle. Things start with, from that moment that you first get the case, through how you first treat it, how you deal with the case-specific elements of it. But you'll always be trying to get to a point where there's an agreement to a problem that needs fixing, and then an action plan to fix it. And then after that, you have this sort of protracted phase of implementation. Again, we'll use some real-life examples now to explain how that works in practice. Michael, just next. Thanks. So these sort of simplifying the decision trees, these are sort of key decision points you'll find through managing a grievance. And the first and simplest one is it in my supply chain? And that is not always very clear. A lot of cases will be in a plantation, and the thing you will know is the mills in your supply chain. You won't always know whether those mills are sourcing from the particular plantation. So that can be challenging, but usually you can get a fairly good idea. The initial engagement, again, the step of potential suspend, or always talk about stop work order, is about sort of urgency and severity. If it's a really serious case, do I need to do something very quickly? If it's deforestation, can I get them to stop? If there's a current harm, if there's known labour abuses or a conflict that's turned violent with the community, is there something can be done to quickly address that? And of course, one of those things might be, I just need to be my company needs to be nowhere near this, and you may choose to suspend. But if you get beyond that, then the idea of liability in sort of deforestation terms is very straightforward, is how much forest did they clear down, and it's usually measured in hectares. That will be a liability that they will need to remediate in some way. But liability can be anything, it can be exploitation related. How can you work out who is the guilty party, which obviously then leads to, has a solution been agreed, and do you have enough sight of that solution? Are all the parties happy with that? Crucially, also always with a grievance, is who's the grievance raiser, and are they engaged effectively, and are they, in the end, are they happy with the process and the outcome? Lift suspension is highlighting a different color because it's something that can move anywhere, and it's a judgment call, and I know I couldn't make that judgment for you. As a company, you will have to balance a number of factors to decide at what point would if I've suspended a company, do I let them back in? Do I say I'm not going to let them back in until everything's absolutely resolved and they've remediated completely, or do I reward them for setting on the right path? And always through this, people always make this point that the moment you suspend, you lose commercial leverage, and therefore you may not have any influence. And that is the reality of palm oil supply chain. So staying in there is a legitimate option, but obviously campaigning NGOs will be saying to you, drop this company, drop it. They're a terrible company. So that is a challenge for you. And equally, that moment that you take them back in is also difficult. And solution deliver, put a question mark then, because, can you be sure, and do you have the evidence? That's sort of the critical thing. And that's not, evidence is often a big issue. So if we move on a little bit now to a particular case, I've picked this one because the rapid response report, you see that one was report 41 from February this year. So over the last few years, there's been many reports from Mighty Earth, a US-based NGO that primarily focuses on deforestation events and has been very active in palm oil supply chains in that time. And they find cases where there's deforestation, and from that supply chain information box from the report there, you can see that they're pretty good at identifying connections, and they have different ways of doing that. So they will present evidence of deforestation as the satellite images you can see there, and they will name company, the traders connected. So, potentially could be a derivatives company. You'll see Oleon in there and Neste, etc. And then obviously lots and lots of brands, and that's very normal. Most grievance reports won't typically name huge numbers of companies, but this is pretty much a checklist of companies that they know are connected. And that's the realities of the palm oil supply chain now. You can link up companies at any level. So yeah, and what you'd normally expect is this sort of early engagement phase is what we kind of call a triage. Is you want to understand how serious it is. Is it in my supply chain? How is it? How am I connected to it? Have my suppliers already responded? Thinking again about the pivotal supplier. Next slide, please. And again, so you get this. It's not sometimes with these reports, but certainly in a lot of reports, the NGO gives typically the brands a window for right of reply. So you often need to respond very quickly, and in your case, you'll be kind of cascading requests potentially very quickly to say, is it definitely in my supply chain? Is anyone doing about this? Has anyone gone to the field to verify it? Also with deforestation cases, as this image is from the Starlink satellite monitoring system. So there are remote ways of verifying cases as well, so we can see this deforestation. The decision point, yeah, so you've got the deforestation peat decision tree, and hopefully you'd have that at your disposal. But be aware, in these early stages, when you've got that first right of reply, you're not going to get a full picture. You're not really going to get anyone that's gone to the field. So it's more to show that you've taken it seriously and you're prepared to act. And that's probably as much as you will get. But obviously, the more information you can get, the stronger your position, the stronger your response can be. Next slide, please. So then the normal process tends to be then you've exercised your right of reply. The brands may then see their own responses played back to them in the report, and hopefully it reflects well on them. But then the report itself comes out, and that's when we would, you know, the companies we support, we will look much deeper into the case. Can we do, you know, what in this case is, as Wilmore already said about the case, what can we corroborate what they've said? Do we have a, you know, what's the network? I think in your case, you know, you are very reliant on what Wilmore say, but the more sources you can get to give you strength, you know, of your position, the better. And obviously, you're trying to get the, you know, the facts and the responses from the company. You know, you are in this position where you're very many stages from the parties involved. You know, the plantation companies. So, getting any sense of what's happening on the ground is really challenging. But as the decision points suggest, they has that company acknowledged that they, you know, so in this case, there's a deforestation event. Have they acknowledged they've done it? You'll see in Wilmore's response, so there is evidence of engagement with those companies. Next slide, please. And then, yeah, as I said before, the solution, then you hope once the liability has been agreed, they will then quickly proceed to an action plan that will map out how they're going to resolve this case. There's often at this point often talk about time-bound action plans, and you see some processes which try and time-bound the whole process. It's really important to understand that some of these cases are very complex, will take a long time to resolve. So we would always say the commitment to time when it's going to be resolved is not what you're looking for. It's not what you're going to get, but what you can get is time-bound commitments to the next stage. And so there's some sense that the case is moving forward. In a deforestation case such as this, and the little extract here, this is from our decision tree, is you expect recovery plans. If a liability for deforestation has been declared, they need to remediate for that. Now, if it's through RSPO, there is the compensation process that they have there, which can either be a project or it can be money, and which can be actually quite expensive for a company to do. So they often would prefer a conservation project. But it doesn't have to be through RSPO. Recovery plans are a wider concept, although they're still pretty rarely used. Next slide, please. And then you get into this sort of, I've kind of highlighted action plan and implementation because they can kind of go alongside each other. You know, it will develop. You'll get evidence that they're doing something, and it'll get more granular, and it'll, you know, get stronger confidence it's happening. And then how do you implement? How do you monitor the implementation, particularly from your position in the supply chain? So it's so important is the evidence you have, and this is where that point about lifting the suspension comes in. Have they done enough to convince you that they will resolve this? You know, then would you lift the suspension? Would you take away the threat of doing so? Yeah. And just to be aware that cases may not reach a very clear point of closure. The a recovery plan is predicated on the idea of a palm oil cycle of 25 years. So you would commit the company to remediate, you know, with like protection or restoration of land, and protect that land for 25 years. So you'll probably close it for a grievance for that, but be aware that it won't be a very clean closure. Next slide, please. So just to very quickly complement that with an exploitation case, I'll try and get through this quickly. I'm aware of time.
There's about 10 more minutes for your part, Rob.
Yeah. So this is a recent case, very high profile in Grievances, Friends of the Earth, US, partnering with Wali, an Indonesian human rights organization. We've known about this dispute for many years. It's very typical in Indonesia. Developing political situations in the 1990s onwards has led to thousands of land conflicts. And this particular case in Sulawesi, involving Astra Agrolestari, involves actually multiple conflicts. It's also complicated with the government. The government has been perceived to have not, you know, have made the situation where siding with the company, allowing the company to develop without all the licenses, etc. As I said, land rights conflicts are very common, but to resolve them, it's a lot of work. It's never as straightforward as you balance out who's told the true story. There's always layers to it, which is where, in this case, it's ended up focusing on a independent investigation, and that's actually still going on as we speak, and we're waiting for the results of that, which are due out imminently. But it gets into all sorts of questions about legitimacy of that, acceptance of that. Meanwhile, Friends of the Earth have got campaign very hard to say you need to drop the whole of the group. But as I say, Astra are a really big palm oil company, so can you even do that? And it will take time, and there are legal challenges that are running concurrently with this. So it points to a very long running and complex case. Next slide, please. So what does it mean for you? So the first thing is, you need to be confident in your own policy commitments and where this fits and what it triggers. Pivotal suppliers are so important. Wilmar and Gar, particularly, I think, have been quite closely involved with this case, and there are other traders, etc. Friends of the Earth have had ongoing campaigning on this, so you'll see. I'm sure your companies won't be named in those, but a lot of your customers for sure will be. Again, suspension. It's a big company with around about 40 mills, I think, in Indonesia. Some people have suspended just the mills inside Sulawesi and left the rest. Some others have actually suspended the whole group. Really tricky to do that. I don't know quite how they've done that, to be honest, unless they're RSPO segregated buyer. So what we would always say is, focus. This is a case that's progressing, so focus on, being a positive voice towards that. Are you getting the information? Can you push for more information? Is there, regular reporting? There has been, actually, in this case, there is regular reporting, but that's what you should be looking for. Some evidence that you can draw and say, this case is moving forward. I'm happy to monitor this case, or, have my voice. And can you bring leverage as a group? Appreciate your leverage is relatively small, but you can grow that. Next slide, please. So just to very quickly summarize, deforestation cases, you're looking for stock work orders where there's current harm. A lot of the assessment of the deforestation and the forest remaining is driven through HCV, HCS studies. I won't go into the detail of what that is now, or land use change analysis. The solution is in remediation and compensation or recovery plans. And you're looking for evidence, the evidence that they're doing this and they're doing each of the steps. Similarly with the exploitation, again, you're looking in the early stages, is there ongoing harm that needs to be addressed urgently? How is it being investigated? Exploitation cases are so hard to assess. You haven't got an equivalent of a satellite monitoring system. So here's the field visits. In the end, it comes down to something short term that stops that ongoing harm, but the longer term will be these kind of complex sort of mediation of conflicts based on FPIC, so free, prior, and informed consent principles. And then again, how do you evidence it? Is enough evidence being presented to you to give you confidence that this has been resolved? Next slide, please. So this is again getting into the mechanism, the mechanics of it really. I'm minded to sort of whiz through this a little bit. This is a race that we produce to get a generic, way of mapping through the process. I think the important message I would give you from this is we would typically see a sustainability function within your organization leading that. And then the key about the race is about bringing in the right people, the risks I talked about earlier. So is there a legal, primarily as a procurement person connected to this and kept in the loop? Legal, again, sort of compliance people. You maybe have people on the sales side that need to be involved, and you probably want to have some kind of senior management escalation. And what you can actually encapsulate that in a grievance committee, you'll see in small letters there. So that's the way you can do it. So you can manage it actually, like one or two people within a sustainability function, but you need to have this wider group that can be mobilized when, these cases have these broad, bigger impacts. Next slide, please. And this is an example log. So the key thing for you to think about here is, one, a log is just a practical tool for tracking, managing a case. You know, as I said, that you'll see a lot of cases and they will run for a long time. So you'll need to know what's the current position, what do we, you know, what has happened, what have we done about this case, who are we waiting to respond to cases. So it's just a practical tool to do that. But you also want to think about, do we want to go public? And you definitely wouldn't just publish that, practically, you know, dynamic log that you're using, but you would consider something that's shorter and to the point. But it's very useful to put something in the public domain that shows that you're, you know, just proof that you're actively managing, and, you know, some of your customers may go straight to that rather than, you know, come to you for answers. So it's another, just a useful tool for, you know, to, you know, advancing your grievance process. Next slide, please. This is an example process from our host, Colgate. Again, I'm not going to go into detail other than say you're going to get these slides. You can take a look and see how they've adapted sort of a more generic approach to their particular needs. Obviously, it's quite relevant to a lot of you guys, as you're probably, you know, suppliers to Colgate. Next slide, please. So this is just really to sum up really what we're talking about. You know, first thing you should do is to come up with a grievance procedure. There is lots of them out there, so you know, there's plenty of templates out there, and consider putting that on your website. As I said, find someone who can lead, ideally a person with a backup who can lead this and drive your grievance response, so they get some continuity and they can build some relationships. Create that log. You know, the first priority is to make it effective internally. Become confident in the process before you consider going public with it. Use it. So we've got these template decision trees, but develop your own that makes sense for you. You can probably simplify them. Hopefully you saw the image I gave shows it can be relatively simple. We've not really touched on this next one, but the no-buy list. Just be aware there's a lot of companies that have no-buy lists. So they've, through the managing of grievances over time, they've picked companies they're no longer prepared to buy from. And they sit on these no-buy lists often for many years. Some of them will be public, some of them they'll keep internal. You might want to consider having one of your own that, you know, tracks what your customers have asked you to do. And, you know, you may have made decisions yourselves. And just the last point really is, you know, think about the fact this is a dynamic process. You know, I got into work today and there's a new grievance, so that they're always happening. There may be a lull, but then they'll happen. And even once they've happened, there's this long process of tracking it and, you know, working out what you can do, what you have to do. And obviously the communication element is so important to your relationship to your customers, your, you know, your commitment to cascade their demands through the supply chain, but also you developing trusting relationships with those suppliers, ideally with their sustainability functions. Build that relationship so it's easier to communicate. Next slide, please. I think this is where I'm going to pass over to John. I think just to say what I've presented here is very generic. You know, I've obviously referenced the particular case of derivatives, but we do recognise you are in a very particular position, your sector, and I will pass now to John. He'll talk a little bit more about that and how we support companies, the derivative companies. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rob. Yes, my name is John Munoz. I am currently managing the Earthworm Foundation Derivative Collaboration Group and also working in the grievance team with Rob Collier. I will share some of the key challenges that we have found in derivative supply chain and which we are tackling through the Earthworm Foundation Derivative Collaboration Group, which I will talk a bit in the next slides about that group. It is common that derivative suppliers are not integrated, so they don't have a greater leverage as usual palm oil supply chain. Also, as part of the nature of the derivative supply chain, regarding more tires than the usual palm oil supply chain, and the small volumes they operate, it impacts specifically on traceability challenges. So also these derivative suppliers don't have those resources that pivotal suppliers have, as Rob Collier mentioned, one of those, for example, Wilmar. Also, based on the nature of their operations, it needs specific requirements that impact on having challenges to find new suppliers. Also, based on the previous history of allegations, derivative suppliers haven't been in the radar for some time. So they have had a lack of awareness, specifically about approaching sustainability issues, which is currently changing due to the recent target to derivative suppliers and also legislation like the EUDR and others. Next one, Michael. For those that participated in the earlier webinars, you heard about the Earthworm Foundation Derivative Collaboration Group, and grievances is one of the elements which is part of the focus of this group, as you can see there. I am aware that in the previous two webinars, we talked about NDPE implementation and traceability, which also is part of this group. And the focus, obviously, of this webinar is grievances. So it is relevant to mention about this group. Just to let you know briefly, in 2020, we incubated this group within the Earthworm membership. There are 8 members, included Colgate, and they are all collectively engaging a select group of focused derivative suppliers to inspire greater impact and foster change. So by working on a consistent and unified message to derivative suppliers and understanding their challenges, the collaboration group is working together to achieve faster policy implementation progress. Over the last 12 months, we have seen some good progress within these focus suppliers. So for anyone that is looking for more information, you can contact me in that email that is shared in this slide. We have invited one of those focus suppliers that is part of this collaboration group to talk about their work and progress on grievances. The supplier is Oleon. So Tina from Oleon will explain the reality of Oleon's handling grievances. The information that she will share is purely from Oleon's point of view and their own experiences. So I am going to pass it over to you, Tina.
Yes, thank you, John. And can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
we can.
Okay, perfect. So hello, everyone. My name is Tine Hoemare. I work for the sustainability team at Oleon. So Oleon is an oleochemical manufacturer with, we are located both in Asia, in Port Klang, and also in Europe. And within the sustainability team, I handle all the grievances that are reaching the CSR team, which can come either from NGOs, where we are mentioned as was shown earlier in the webinar, like for example, Mighty Earth, where Oleon's name is made public, but it can also come from our customers who have been targeted by campaigns as well. So how do we handle grievances internally? If you could go to the next slide. And so for Oleon, so we have an internal grievance management procedure. It is currently internal. We don't make it public yet. So on our website, we don't have a public grievance log. We keep it all internal for now, but we do work on both environmental and social issues. So we track both. And the main procedure that we go through when we are either contacted ourselves by an NGO or we are contacted by a customer is that the very first thing is that we need to confirm if the issue raised is indeed a grievance, if it's still going on, that it's not a very old case that's been outdated, and also that it's relevant to our supply chain. Of course, we track issues in the palm supply chain, but very close to palm plantations, you can also have pulp and paper plantations, there can be mining activities, and so on. So the very first thing for us is to make sure that we are talking really about a palm grievance. And here we are supported by Rob's team, by Earthworm, who is investigating it before we start our own internal process. And then we start linking it to our own supply chain. So we ask traceability information from all our palm suppliers, and we ask it until mill level. And then we will see if we can link the grievance to a certain mill in our supply chain. And then the suppliers who are linked to that mill will then be included in our grievance process. And they will then receive some kind of recommendation for us, which can be either provide information or be an active player to handle any corrective actions, or in the very worst case, to ask for a suspension of that producer. I do want to say that from an Oleon's point of view, suspension for us is the very last resort. We are really focusing on engagement and transformation. So we want to make sure that the producer or the plantation or whatever is part of that grievance, that they have the opportunity to resolve the issue, that there may be a mediator assigned, or that they can show us a corrective action plan so that we don't have to remove this producer from our supply chain, because it's best to keep them here and to just make them better and make the situation better than just removing them and let someone else deal with it. Then we update our customers very frequently on what we are doing. So of course, once the grievance is sent to us, we will of course update our affected customers. But every time that we hear that something new is going on within the case, because these grievances, as has been mentioned, it can take quite long, and some of our grievances have been open for 2 or 3 years, that we keep them up to date on what is going on. So that's really something that we need to do from our side to make sure that they get always the latest information. And then if indeed there is a really big issue, that we keep also monitoring it. So we keep asking our suppliers to share information with us, or we try to keep up to date by reading NGO reports or by asking Earthworm if they have any new updates to share with us, so that we can change the request that we have for our supply chain if needed. For example, if we can go from suspension to letting them back into our supply chain. But as I said, our main focus is to keep them in our supply chain and just improve the situation. Within Oleon, I'm the main person working on palm, so that's too much work for one person to do. So that is why, as of 2021, we have a partnership with Earthworm, who is supporting us in our grievances, because we don't have all the knowledge. We are quite far removed from the plantation, so we don't really know what is going on there. And very often, Earthworm will already have a report available, or they will be working on a report that really summarizes everything that's going on with the case, that gives us better information on how we can then proceed as a company. And if it is difficult to link certain cases to the mill list that we have, then they can also assist us in making sure that we are looking at the right mills, and therefore also including the right suppliers in this case, to make sure that we are working as efficient as possible. That is how we work. Now, of course, we also run into some challenges, which I have put in the next slides. So we have 3 main challenges that we mainly run into. The very first one, and this might be familiar for those who are active in the derivative supply chain, is that we have a very large palm supply chain. It's over 1,300. It used to be even over 2,000 mills. So it's very, very big. And we are also very far removed. We don't buy from the plantations. We don't even buy from the mills. There are often 3 to 4 companies in between us and the plantation, which makes it very difficult for us to really go to the ground and try and resolve the issue ourselves. That's definitely the biggest challenge that we face. The other one is that, as Rob mentioned with the no-buy list, we have some customers who are more on the consumer goods side. So they are, of course, much more public. They get much more reputational damage than maybe Oleon can get as a B2B. But they will often have a very strict zero tolerance approach. And if they hear anything about a grievance, they will just say, remove them from the supply chain. We don't want to have anything to do with them, which is not how we see it. So that's something also difficult, that they want to go much further and be much stricter than what we want to be. And then also, for some of our ingredients, there are not that many suppliers available. So sometimes there could be a mill or a plantation that indeed is not doing the best environmentally or socially wise, but economically, we can't always have an alternative supplier, and it might cause any supply chain disruptions for us. So there's also definitely a very big challenge for us to handle. Now, how do we handle this? We don't just sit there and just let it all go its course. No, we do try to tackle these. So the first thing that we do is, you need to understand your sphere of influence. You can't go to the plantation and fix the issue yourself. You need to see, okay, where can I put some pressure? Who can I contact? And then go from there. So for us, our sphere of influence is really our tier 1 suppliers, our direct suppliers. So we cascade our engagement, our wishes, our requirements to them. And then we ask them to cascade this further with their suppliers, on and on and on, until you eventually reach the producer that is affected. you take your responsibility for your own suppliers, but then they also need to work further on the case. So you need to be quite engaged with them, and they need to be engaged to follow it up with their own supply chain, because you can't reach your indirect suppliers. That's very difficult for us. You also need to be very transparent towards your customers. You can't just ignore the email or just say like, okay, we're working on it, but then keep silent. That's not really very much appreciated. So we are actually very transparent. If we face difficulties, if we say like, okay, this is really something that you're asking us that is very difficult for us to fulfill, and we think that going towards a corrective action might be a better option than a suspension, then we just say that. We talk to them. We get Rob on board in calls with our customers to explain why we can't adhere to certain no-buy lists, and they are quite understanding and they're quite open to it. So don't be afraid to reach out to them and share any difficulties that you might experience. And you can also try and work together with them to put more pressure on the supply chain. If you have companies like a Unilever or a Nestle or a Procter & Gamble who is supporting your cause, and they also want to put their weight into the discussion, then embrace it and try and reach out to your suppliers together with maybe signed letters or statements that are from both companies, which we have done in the past. And stay in touch with your suppliers. Very often the case will come into your mailbox. It's a very hot case. Everybody jumps on it. And then once the first communication is out, it's silent. Try to keep in touch with your suppliers. We have quarterly calls with some of our biggest suppliers, where we then check, okay, what is going on? Do you have any updates you can share with us? Or our suppliers will just send us the updates themselves to keep us up to date. And we do ask them to do that to us, so that if a customer comes back to us half a year later asking, so what happened with your first communication? What is the situation right now? Then you can immediately respond because you got the latest information from your supplier. And also try and put all your efforts into the one that you think might have the biggest chance to resolve the issue as successfully as possible. As been mentioned in this webinar, if you have a Wilmar or a Cargill or a Musimas that is affected with the grievance, then try to reach out to them and see if they can go further, because they very often will have people who will go go on the ground and see for themselves what is going on. For example, Wilmar, they often send mediators to the field. So you don't have to contact all 10 of your suppliers that are linked to this case. You can really appoint one supplier that you think will have the highest impact, and then ask them to take the lead in this case and see how far that they can go, because not all your suppliers will have the same weight and strength in order to do so. That is very short how we are handling it and how we are trying to tackle these challenges. But it's definitely an ongoing thing, and you need a lot of transparency, you need a lot of communication, and you really also need the engagement of your supply chain. So indeed, make sure that the suppliers you are working with, that they also have this kind of mechanism in place and that they are willing to work on it, because if not, then it will be quite difficult to have any corrective actions with them. So that is all from my side, John and Michael, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tina. I think it's really valuable to hear some of that coming directly from you and your experience and your challenges. You know, hearing from us is one thing. We obviously have a lot of experience and we have a lot of knowledge that we can share, but it's different from a company perspective, right? So thank you so much for sharing that. And we look forward to continuing to continue on this journey with Oleon and hopefully other suppliers in the future. So thank you so much. Before we jump into the Q&A, I just wanted to note that there are some resources available that we have put on these next two slides. So the first one here is some examples of company procedures, grievance procedures. So we have a mix of different companies here. As you can see, we have some consumer goods brands. We have some of those refiners that we were talking about, those key priority suppliers. And then we also have examples of, you know, two derivatives companies as well. So please take a look at these. You'll notice that they're all different. I think they all follow the same guiding principles, which we discussed on this webinar, but the importance is that you customize it to meet your own company's needs, but also you must adhere to some of these best management practices that we discussed today. On the next slide, we also have some tools and resources here that can really help you dig a little bit deeper into some of the topics that we discussed today. So we did kind of scratch the surface on many different things today, but there are many available tools and resources online that can help you understand these concepts better and can help you develop your own mechanism, develop your own log, and continue that journey engaging our suppliers, actively managing grievances. So please take a look at these resources, and they will be shared in the slides that are distributed after the webinar. So I see we have a few questions that have come in, but before we jump into that, I just wanted to do a quick wrap up of the webinar series. So this is the last of the 3 webinars that we did over the last 2 months. I just wanted to take the time to thank Colgate and CGF for sponsoring this event, and bringing their members in to invite their suppliers. So I think we had a very good attendance on all 3 webinars. Whether you are a supplier to Colgate or another FPC member, I think really the point of these webinars is not just to bring you up to speed on these topics and drive change within your company, but also to leverage all the different types of collective action that is happening within the industry. So John, talked about that derivatives collaboration group. There's also ASD, which is another. And really, the idea is not for everyone to go away and do this on their own and for those demands to cascade down. Please reach out to your customers and to people like Earthworm, ProForest, ASD to really help if you're having issues. We want you to inform us if there are things that you're struggling with or if there are problems that you have that you can't tackle, and we can help you through that. So, many times throughout this webinar, we mentioned that collective action across the supply chain. So, that's what's really important. And I think that's the message that we're trying to send in these 2 webinars. So what we discussed over the last 2 months is, how to develop a policy and why that's so important. That's really the foundation for everything that follows. Next being, traceability and supply chain mapping, which is all about transparency. And that's also very important to be able to manage grievances and to be able to confirm those links within the supply chain, right? So if you look at this diagram that we showed in the first and second webinar, it's the VTTV model. We were really focused on this right side, the values and transparency. I think as we move forward with these webinars and capacity building events for suppliers, we really want to hear from you as to what will be most valuable to you and what will add most value to your life and your company's life. And maybe that is more discussion on transformation, or maybe that's more discussion on verification. But what we want to make sure is that some of these really core principles, including policy, traceability, and grievance and non-compliance, those are really the core of an implementation approach and an NDPE journey. So again, thank you, everyone. I'm sure we've had some people that have joined all 3 webinars, which is fantastic. I know we had some people that maybe just joined one. So we hope that for those who attended, that they really took something away from these webinars and will implement action within their company. So I think before we jump into the Q&A, I think it would be great in the chat to please share how you use today's training and the other trainings. What would you like to know more about related to this webinar? And then what new topics would you like us to cover in the future? And if you don't have anything in mind today, we will be sharing a post-webinar survey to just get some quick feedback on today's webinar specific to the grievance topic. But we're also planning to send out a little bit more of a target follow-up just to really check in and see, if these concepts were digested within your company and how you kind of plan to move that forward into action. So please do go ahead and share. And while you're sharing, I think we can go ahead and respond to 2 questions that we have here that have come through. I think it would be good for Rob to maybe start off by answering this first question, and then also, if Tina or Ron, if you want to jump in based on your experience, I think that would be really valuable. So the first one here is, what is the best practice to address the situation when my company's grievance mechanism has a different or slightly different criteria in deciding the next steps? For example, one company might decide to trigger suspension, but the other might not. And, I think, this is a good question. And I think there's been a lot of debate on this topic. Many years ago, there was a debate about, suspend first or engage first. Tina obviously shared Oleon's approach to how they handle these types of situations, but I know, Rob, you probably have come across many situations like this. So it'd be good maybe for you to kick this one off.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a very good question. Thanks. So he's put links again to a little bit what Tina said and my point about the importance of the procurement team's involvement, because in the end, it's what can you do on suspension? So maybe in this example, one company feels they can do it because it's very easy to remove a company, another one, for whatever reason, can't spare that, it's a much bigger undertaking to remove somebody. I think my response would be, what's your position first? What, if you had complete control over this, what would you want to do? And if you come to the conclusion that yes, we think this company should be suspended, then the question back to the company that's refusing to do that is, well, what evidence have they got to say that they shouldn't be suspended? We honestly, Earthworm don't really focus too much on suspensions. We're very keen to see cases just move forward and for companies to use their leverage. So we would say in this case, use your leverage. Say, look, we expect something to be happening here. If you're not going to suspend, then you need to be pushing for action. But it's, as Michael said, it's a common thing we see, and it doesn't get answered easily. And the example I gave of Astra, I suspect majority of companies that don't just have RSPO seg would really struggle to suspend an entire group like that. But there are steps along the way to that you can consider as well. And if Ron or Tina, you want to add anything?
Sure, Rob. It's Ron here. Yeah. So, I mean, I think I would reiterate, I think much of what's been said. Definitely, I think there's, I think the important point is to sort of have the process, have the procedures, stay true to following the process. But obviously, there are decision points, and at those decision points, particularly suspend and engage is definitely one of those ones where it's really important that companies, I guess, understand sort of their position in that space in the supply chain, what leverage, what impact you can have, and I guess to some degree also a bit of tolerance to the pressures on the case. As Rob had mentioned also, removing a supplier from a supply may in some cases be relatively easy, in some cases highly complex or impossible almost. But I think the most important thing is that whatever that decision that you make, if that's to suspend, then you need to ensure that you have a process in place that would allow them to re-enter your supply chain potentially if there are corrective actions that are completed, or if you do choose to stay engaged, obviously, then there really is the evidence and the demonstrating progress that you are engaged, and that you're engaging with your suppliers and taking the actions that you need to take to continue to push it forward. So yeah, completely agreed with kind of the positions that have been stated.
Thanks, Ron. Tina, anything to add to that one? Or?
Yes, I mean, of course, I agree with what's been said. From us, also a practical example, we had a very recent case where we got a no-buy list from a customer, and because it was very high level and vague, it was quite difficult to implement it within our own supply chain. So here, indeed, we came to the conclusion that if we could still find a link in our own supply chain of a male plantation producer whatsoever that was linked to that no-buy list, that we would then open a grievance and that we would keep our customer informed on any corrective actions that were taking place there. So instead of indeed just flat out removing them, that we just update them on all the good things that they are doing in order to showcase at a certain level that now the risk should indeed be gone and they should not worry anymore of having this company in their supply chain. So this is one way, and we do this the other way around as well, where if we ask for a suspension, then our suppliers will need to give us corrective actions that this company has done in order for us to say, okay, then we will allow them back in. So it's not like a static black or white thing. It's very, it lives, all these grievances, they live, they change all the time, and that you can keep track of all the progress that has been made, if there's any. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Tina. We have a similar question here, I think, and this is kind of more related to indirect suppliers and sharing of information. So this question is how to deal with a case from an indirect supplier when the information is being kept as confidential, especially the information not being shared to my company. So I think this is talking about a case where it's an indirect supplier in your supply chain. So maybe entering your supply chain through one of your tier 1 suppliers, and you have no direct relationship with them, but the information is not being cascaded down to you for various reasons. So how would you handle a case like that, Rob, where you're a little bit farther removed from the specific supplier or the specific plantation or mill that's been indicted?
So I think the question you've got to ask is, where else can I get information? Obviously, as Tina said, we support Oleon to do that, but we also talked about pivotal suppliers who publish a lot of information. Can you access that information from other sources? Honestly, the confidentiality issue, to me, it's bogus. There isn't legitimate reasons for confidentiality. I think I'd also say to you, you can push back by quoting, EUDR, and there's going to be human rights legislation that's going to demand this level of transparency. So just saying it's confidential is just not going to cut it. But for now, practically, there are ways of accessing information from different sources. Your tier 1 is your first port of call, but if they're not providing, there are other ways of finding out. Verifying if it's a credible grievance, finding out if there's something happening to work with it. Sorry, to progress the case. I don't know, anyone else got anything to add to that?
I would just maybe add to that by saying that, I think at the forefront, I think it's important to just show that your company is serious about managing grievances. So, if you're a company that doesn't have a public grievance procedure and you haven't been actively managing grievances, some of your suppliers might not take you seriously when you contact them about a case, right? I think that also has to do with building trust, right? So sometimes if you're asking suppliers for ad hoc requests to give you information, but you haven't taken the time to build that relationship, the chances of you getting more information, I think, will be better if you've taken the time to build a relationship with that supplier and build trust. But as Rob said, I think as new regulations come out and as new expectations increase with regards to transparency, it's going to be very hard to move away from confidential information. There's also ways around that. If suppliers continue to say that things are confidential, there's always NDAs or agreements that you can make with your supplier to more openly share that information. I don't know if Tina or Ron have anything to add to that, but I'm sure they both kind of have faced similar issues where it's an indirect supplier.
Yes, indeed. And what I could maybe share as a tip is to try and get the right person with your supplier, because very often you will be in touch with the salesperson of that company because they are in contact with your buyers, but very often they will not have a very open way of communicating because they see it indeed as confidentiality, that we might go to their own supplier and that they will lose their business. While if you try and get a hold of someone within their sustainability team, which the main large palm handlers do have, then you get a very different story. So try to get your connections there. Try to not on a certain grievance, but just in general, like, hey, can we talk about your Palm sourcing approach with your sustainability team? Can we get a hold of them? And then keep that person as your contact for when a grievance comes along, and the type of discussion you will have with them will be very different, and they are very often much more open, and it will make it much easier to have this kind of discussions with them.
Great.
Yeah, nothing else really for me to materially add. I think all the points there are really relevant. I think to your point, Michael, how, you know, what tools can you potentially use to get the information? Things like NDAs definitely can be used, even though not necessarily preferred all the time.
Right.
But you know, these are very typical challenges. And I completely agree with building that trust is another key point of that, because that really will open up some information from time to time. So yeah, no, I think good responses from everyone.
Great. Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and I see something has come through the chat here. So this is a question about, you know, how do we really raise that sector collective action on kind of grievance issues? And I think a lot of us, you know, a lot of companies, you know, a lot of Ron's peers and Tina's peers are all managing maybe the same cases, right? Are all trying to get updates on the same cases. So how do we kind of bring that together and have more collective action on these cases? I guess I'll maybe let Rob or John kick things off, but we've discussed Earthworm's approach to this, where we do have a derivatives collaboration group, where one of the focuses is grievances. We also have another grievance service for our members, where we're all coming together and openly sharing information about cases. I don't know, Rob, if you have anything to add to that, or John has anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's just worth being really honest about this, that once you get into the idea of collaboration, it gets quite tricky, you know, because there is a, you know, commercial sort of sensitivity around it all. Getting too close. I cited an example a few years ago where I tried to get a lot of companies to all sign the same letter to take action on a particular case. Yeah. Once it goes into the legal teams of companies, it's a minefield. So actual collaboration like that can be quite tricky. But, you know, what our approach is, you know, that we are sharing the same idea. So we'll write a report on a case, we'll give our opinion about what we think should happen, and we send that opinion to 20 companies. So just by doing that, I accept there's a chance that 20 companies then go and ask the same question, but that's still not so bad. Or, you know, we can maybe help to sort of, you know, who's got the most leverage here. So there's a little bit of that as well. You know, certain companies have got strong leverage that can act on it, and others don't. I think I'll probably pass to John as well. And I think, you know, also we mentioned ASD as well. The same idea is understanding that derivatives suppliers typically are this very complex supply chain, often boils down to quite small volumes per mill. That's very hard to act on. So this is why this sort of, you know, formal collective approaches make sense. John, do you want to add something?
Yeah, no, I would add. I mean, just continue with your comments. Our derivative group obviously is one example, but as you, Michael, mentioned, there are others, ASD, CGF. And in the case of our group, I mean, it's just having these customers of common suppliers and having these leverage together with those suppliers. I think this is a key message to influence those specific suppliers, no? This is our way of working, but I mean, I think it's something similar in other groups as well as ASD, CGF, that when we have these common customers of few suppliers, the leverage can be greater than obviously tackling separately and individual as members. Yeah, so that's something that is relevant for these kind of groups.
Great, thanks for that, John. Okay, with that being said, I think we are going to close out the webinar now. So just want to say one more time, thank you everyone for joining, especially those who have joined the last 3 webinars. We're very pleased with the outcome of these events, and we look forward to continuing this in the future, whatever shape or form that might be. So we really encourage you to fill out the post-webinar survey, and also be on the lookout for more targeted follow-ups from your customers to talk more specifically about the webinars and some of the gaps within your business and within your company. So thank you very much. We also want to give a special thanks to Tina for joining today. It was really great to have you on the call. And also thanks to Rob and John for leading the training. So thank you very much to everyone, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you.